Hello class, and welcome to the first of hopefully a short series of lectures designed to fill in the gaps in the lesson plan formed by the large number of snow days we've had. So to keep you honest, there's going to be a short quiz, very short, in the Angel folder. It's going to replace your participation grade for the day. So look out for that. Ready? Let's go. Earlier, I compared federalism to a marriage between the states and the federal government. The wet marriage document being the Constitution. Perhaps a better analogy would be a three-way tug-of-war between three actors: the states, the federal government, and the people. For today's lesson, we will consider 4 Supreme Court cases that shaped the balance of power in our federal system. These are McCulloch versus Maryland, Gibbons versus Ogden, Barron versus Baltimore, and not going to say it, spoiler alert, it's about Obamacare. McCulloch versus Maryland was the opening shot in the war between state power and federal power. It dealt with the creation of a national bank not unlike the Federal Reserve today, chartered by Congress and independent of the states, despite operating within their borders. Maryland didn't like this. They didn't like having a bank that they could not control operating in their jurisdiction, so it imposed a tax on all of their banknotes. James McCulloch, the head of the Baltimore branch of the Second National Bank of the United States, refused to pay the tax, and it went to court. Maryland argued in court that since nowhere in the Constitution had Congress been given the explicit right to charter a bank, no such right existed. Whereas the federal government argued that the right to charter a bank was implied by the Constitution. For instance, Congress had the right to regulate interstate commerce, which is what the central bank would be doing, and creating a national bank was a sensible way to achieve that end. Ultimately, the Supreme Court sided with the federal government, beginning a long trend of power migrating from the states to the national government. The key to understanding McCulloch versus Maryland is that it is the case which tested the proposition that Congress has vast implied powers in addition to its specifically enumerated powers, that just because something was not written in the Constitution did not mean ipso facto Congress could not do it. In fact, there was a lot of wiggle room which Congress could squeeze into to regulate, for instance, the environment, or healthcare regulation, or the drug trade. Gibbons v. Ogden was a case involving river travel, rivers being the interstate highways of their age. New York had granted a monopoly on steamship travel within their waterways to 2 men, who in turn sold licenses to steamship operators wishing to do business in that state. This arrangement fell apart the moment one steamship operator, Mr. Gibbons, realized that he could get his license from the U.S. Congress more cheaply. He was sued by his former business partner, Mr. Ogden, who had a license from the original monopolists. The problem here is that clearly both New York and Congress cannot have an exclusive right to the same waterway. That's not how a monopoly works. So New York asserted that its monopoly was more valid, whereas Congress asserted that its monopoly was in fact the only valid one because of interstate commerce, rivers being the main thoroughfare of interstate commerce at the time. Logically, the river travel between states belonged to them. Long story short, the Supreme Court sided with the federal government again. The monopoly was dismantled, and in case you're keeping score, that's federal government 2, state governments 0. Barron v. Baltimore was a surprising decision that empowered the states even as it quashed personal rights and freedoms. The case involved Mr. John Barron, who operated a wharf in Baltimore. Construction projects in his neighborhood were responsible for dumping tons of dirt and silt into his waters, rendering his wharf unusable and depriving him of a livelihood. John Barron sued the city citing the Sixth Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, claiming that what the city had done was tantamount to seizing his property without just compensation. He lost the case when the Supreme Court ruled that the Bill of Rights, in fact, did not apply to the states, but only to the national government. Now, this was a very influential case for the time, but not so much for our time, because eventually this view fell out of favor, and today nearly all of the amendments have been made to apply to the states as well as to the federal government. But this was the turning point. The Supreme Court's 2011 ruling on the Affordable Care Act was specifically centered around the individual mandate, the part of the healthcare legislation that penalized consumers for not buying a product, in this case, health insurance. More generally, it was a state-imposed challenge to the federal government for muscling in on its turf, which was healthcare regulation. The states argued that Congress could not impose a penalty on consumers for inaction, nor could it threaten to revoke federal aid if states did not comply with its legislation. Congress argued that healthcare was interstate commerce, and the necessary and proper clause of the Constitution allowed them to act in this way. The Supreme Court sided with Congress in part and the states in part. They ruled that the individual mandate was okay, was legal, was constitutional, not for the reasons that Congress had set forth, but for the reason that the individual mandate was, to all intents and purposes, a tax. Obama and the Democrats in the Senate had refused to consider the individual mandate a tax because that would be deeply unpopular with the people. Ironically, despite, or rather because of that, the law was considered legal. As far as the states were concerned, they won a small victory, though. The Supreme Court said it was not fair that Washington should refuse to dispense funds such as Medicaid for failing to meet their obligations. That gets us to now. The Affordable Care Act is law, and the law requires that Medicaid be expanded. Medicaid, not to be confused with Medicare, is a program that provides health care to those too poor to afford it. Otherwise, it is a form of welfare. It is funded partly by the national government and partially by the states. And Governor Nathan Deal of Georgia has refused to expand the program. According to the Supreme Court ruling that I just mentioned, he can do this. He claims it is about saving money and responsible spending, but since Georgians will not actually save money, since this is funded by our tax dollars, which are going to Washington anyway, this claim is suspect. Actually, what it is really about is power, because Medicaid is funded by a categorical grant provided by Congress, and Governor Deal has said himself that he wants a block grant instead. Now then, what is a categorical grant? A categorical grant is essentially a rebate program. The state of Georgia has been promised to be reimbursed by the federal government 100% for the first 3 years for the entirety of the Medicaid expansion. So it is cost neutral. It costs us nothing for 3 years. But there's an asterisk there because we don't see the money right away. It's a rebate in that we have to pay the full cost of the expansion ourselves from our own funds, keep all of our receipts, keep everything itemized, and then send that information to the national government, who will pore over our files and determine that yes, indeed, we are complying with the program, and then they will channel the money into Georgia's coffers in around about 6 months. So it's free, but you have to have the money up front. In the same way that if you were to buy a camera on sale and it's a $2,000 camera, but with this $500 rebate, it's actually a $1,500 camera and a much better deal. But you don't see that $500 right away. You have to pay $2,000 now and get $500 back later. A block grant, by contrast, is much simpler. Washington would just write us a check for however much money they estimate it's going to cost us to expand the Medicaid program. We would cash this check, and we would use the money right away to pay for the expansion or for any purpose that we desire. There's no muss, no fuss. It's very easy to understand, and we don't have to scramble to divert funds from other sources because we don't have it right up front, because we do have it right up front. We get the money and then we spend it. Now, this sounds like all upside, and it is for the state of Georgia and for Nathan Deal. But for Congress and for the president, this is troubling, because once Georgia has the funds, can they be trusted to actually use them for their original intended purpose? Once we have the money, can't we just spend it on anything that we want, like new squad cars for the police officers, or a raise for teachers, or any number of other worthy objectives that have nothing at all to do with expanding the Medicaid program? Can Georgia be trusted? Congress says no. So far they have refused to play the governor's game, and it's just a game of chicken between the two states and federal government, which has so far seen no resolution. Personally, I don't think the governor has a chance. Congress doesn't care if Georgia gets its money or it doesn't. Congress will not suffer for this in the polls. Obama is not running for re-election. Deal won't suffer either. The poor already don't support him, and most of them don't vote anyway. No, the people most affected by the stonewalling are all Georgians. The poor recipients of Medicaid most directly, but also hospitals, health insurance providers, and their customers indirectly. We will all pay higher premiums if Georgia's poor do not have access to health care. This is not a cost-saving measure, it is a cost-raising measure. But it is also the latest in a series of battles fought between the state and federal government. Unfortunately, we, the people, here as is so often the case, tend to get caught in the crossfire. In conclusion then, federalism is a power struggle fought between the states and the federal government and the people. The Constitution lists the rules of the game, but our understanding of the rules continues to evolve. And the Supreme Court is the ultimate referee, but the court of public opinion also has an undeniable influence. That's it. Thank you for listening.